Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Glad that you could return for another segment. In this segment, we're going to be talking with Dr. Jorge DiMartino. He's joining us here as Chief Medical Officer and Executive VP of Clinical Development at Kronos Bio. He's joining us this evening to discuss the company's 3 investigational compounds being advanced for patients with cancer. Welcome to Health Professional Radio. Dr. DiMartino, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Neil. Happy to be here.
You are Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of Clinical Development at Kronos Bio. Give us a little bit more about yourself and talk about your role at Kronos Bio.
Sure. So I am a pediatric oncologist by training. Trained at Stanford back in the 90s. Did my pediatrics residency and fellowship in hematology oncology there. Also have a Ph.D. and was always very interested in laboratory research and really trying to understand cancer and bringing new therapies to patients based on that increased understanding. Mm-hmm. I left academia in around 2005 to start an industry job at Genentech and was there for about 6 years. I subsequently moved to Celgene, where I spent 8.5 years in the Translational Development Group and came to Kronos in 2019. And I've been here for the past almost 2.5 years now.
So what is Kronos Bio's mission and vision?
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. I mean, Neil, as you know, I think we've made substantial strides in a lot of cancer types. You can think of things like Gleevec in chronic myelogenous leukemia, which has, really kind of changed the face of that disease. The recent advent of a lot of the immunotherapies, which are having huge impacts in lung disease, lung cancer, melanoma. At the same time, the glass is kind of half empty. There are a lot of cancer types, AML being one of them. This is an indication where we're putting a lot of emphasis on, where most patients, more than half of patients diagnosed today, will ultimately die of their disease. There's still a lot of unmet need there, and our vision, is a world where we've taken at least one of these high unmet need cancer types and made it into a treatable disease where it's no longer a death sentence for people, and so that's what we're in business to do.
Now, I understand that you have 3 investigational compounds that target transcription. First of all, tell us about transcription, and then talk about Kronos Bio's approach as opposed to approaches from other companies in the same field.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. So transcription really refers to the first step in taking the information that's contained in the genome, in DNA, and turning it into action. So it's that first step where you make an RNA copy of the gene in the DNA that gets turned into protein, and ultimately that's what drives a cell's behavior. So the step of transcription is very highly regulated, as you can imagine. It involves a lot of other proteins, transcription factors, upstream and downstream signaling, all of which sort of forms a network, a very sort of complex wiring diagram, if you will, that regulates how that information is transmitted. And in cancer, we know that it becomes dysregulated. Right? Cancer is often thought of as a genetic disease, a disease that results from certain mutations. I think what's less well appreciated is that many of these mutations end up dysregulating the transcription. So you have genes that are turned on and not turned off when they should be turned off, genes that control cell growth and survival. And so at Kronos, we're really focusing on that part of how cancer arises and is maintained, how these transcriptional regulatory networks become dysregulated. And so we have sort of a couple of tools in this fight. So, we're certainly not alone in recognizing the importance of transcription as a target in cancer. I think the reason that many companies have either not tried or have failed at going after it is it's just very, very challenging from a technical standpoint. Most of the targets that medicines have been developed against for cancer, mostly enzymes and cell surface receptors, they follow certain rules that make it, relatively more straightforward to find drugs that bind to them. Transcription factors don't follow those rules. And so really what you need is a better mousetrap, just a completely different approach for going after drugs that will modulate transcription. And so what we have at Kronos are sort of two key pieces. One being just a lot of computational horsepower to understand these networks. As you can imagine, these networks are very complex. They have lots of inputs and outputs, and the sorts of experiments that are done to try to understand them generate large volumes of data. And to make sense of it, you really need strong computational approaches, machine learning, those sorts of things. That is married to, what I call our better mousetrap, and that's the small molecule microarray. As I mentioned, transcription factors don't play by the same rules as other drug targets. And so to go after them, you need a different sort of approach. The small molecule microarray platform allows us to look for small molecules that bind to transcription factors or their associated cofactors. And so putting these two things together, the ability to understand how these networks are wired, where the vulnerabilities are, together with a platform that lets us identify small molecules that can achieve that, that's the Kronos difference.
Tell us about these three compounds, how they differ, and whether or not they are approved, FDA approved, or when you anticipate approval.
Certainly. So none of our compounds are FDA approved. We have three compounds in clinical development. Two of them target a protein called SYK, which is an important mediator in certain genetically defined subsets of AML. So AML patients with certain recurring mutations at genes such as NPM1, FLT3, or MLL, they require SYK to drive AML. And so entosplentinib is our lead agent. It's in phase 3 study now in patients with NPM1 mutated AML. We're anticipating top-line data from that study in the second half of 2023. And we're hopeful that approval will follow from that. Lenraplenib is a related compound, also targeting SYK, but with certain advantages over entosplentinib, but it's farther behind in development. It's in phase 1 right now, meaning that we're still trying to define the right dose of the drug to use in AML, but we're very hopeful that will become a cornerstone of future regimens combined with other medicines that target genetically defined subsets of AML. Finally, our compound KB742 was discovered internally using the small molecule microarray platform that I mentioned earlier. This targets CDK9, which is a protein that is a requirement for certain tumors that are addicted to the process of transcription. So these would be certain types of lung cancer or breast cancer with amplifications, extra copies of a gene called MYC. We think this makes those tumors dependent on CDK9, and by inhibiting CDK9, we hope to have activity against those tumors. There's also rarer soft tissue sarcomas that often affect adolescents and young adults that are driven by transcription factors that we hope to target also with KB742. This is, again, it's still in phase 1, so it will probably be, sometime before, if we're fortunate, that molecule reaches FDA approval.
Well, give us a website where we can learn much more about Kronos Bio.
Yeah, you can go to kronosbio.com. Should be able to get the information there.
And it's spelled just like it sounds, Kronos, Kronos bio.com. Is that correct, George?
BIO. Yeah, all one word.
All right. I appreciate you joining us here on Health Professional Radio this evening, George. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Hopefully you'll return.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Dr. Jorge DiMartino, Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of Clinical Development at Kronos Bio. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/healthprofessionalradio.